Egypt is one of the oldest civilizations in the world, with a history that dates back over 5,000 years. It is home to some of the most iconic landmarks in the world, including the Great Pyramids of Giza, the Sphinx, and the Valley of the Kings. While there are many stories I could go in depth about, this video will briefly focus on three things: Egypt's geography, economy, and military. And specifically how it compares to other African and Middle Eastern countries regarding these three topics. So let's get started with geography. Egypt is bordered by the Mediterranean Sea to the north, Libya to the west, Sudan to the south, the Red Sea to the east, and Israel and Gaza to the northeast. How does Egypt compare to the U.S.? Well, Egypt is similar in size to the states of Texas and New Mexico combined. Compared to Europe, Egypt is similar in size to France and Italy combined. Egypt is the 13th largest African country by area. The largest country by area in Africa is Algeria. The second largest is the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The third largest is Sudan, Egypt's neighbor to the south. Finally, the fourth largest is Libya, Egypt's neighbor to the west. The Nile's importance to Egypt can't be understated. It's said that Egypt is the Nile, and the Nile is Egypt. The Nile's water comes from a variety of lush African countries near the equator, but there are two main sources, Lake Victoria and Lake Tana. The White Nile starts at Lake Victoria and travels north through Uganda, South Sudan, and into Sudan. The Nile continues north into Egypt, where it empties into the Mediterranean Sea. The Nile has two main tributaries. The White Nile comes from Lake Victoria. It is longer, but only provides 20% of the total water. The Blue Nile comes from Lake Tana in Ethiopia. It is shorter and provides 80% of the water. The White and Blue Nile meet at the city of Khartoum in Sudan. Egypt has the 14th largest population out of 195 countries on Earth. But how does Egypt rank among other African countries? Nigeria is the most populated country in Africa, with 217 million people, representing 15% of the total population. The second most populated country is Ethiopia, with 107 million. Egypt is the third, with 102 million. And finally, the Democratic Republic of the Congo comes right after Egypt, with 95 million. Most of the population centers are located in the Nile Delta and along the Mediterranean coast, and also along the Gulf of Suez, as well as the Nile River Valley. The largest city is Cairo, with a population of 10 million. However, the Cairo metropolitan area has 22 million. The second largest city in Egypt is Alexandria, with a population of 5 million. Egyptians use only 6% of the total land area for economic purposes, and they live on only 3% of the land. Egypt's current economic policy is aimed at diversification. Since the 2000s, many reforms have helped it move toward a more market-driven economy, prompting increased foreign investment. Egypt is now benefiting from its relative political stability, proximity to Europe, and increased exports. Let's see how Egypt compares to other nations. I will be using GDP as the economic metric to compare Egypt with other countries. GDP is the monetary amount of all goods and services produced by a country in a specific time period, usually a year. There are two main types of GDP, nominal and PPP, or purchase power parity. Nominal GDP is the actual monetary value of all goods and services produced in a year, not adjusted for cost of living. PPP, on the other hand, takes into account the relative costs of goods and services between various countries. Since we are going to be doing a lot of comparisons, it's GDP PPP for the win. Egypt has the highest GDP of any African country at $1.8 trillion annually, but it ranks 8th in GDP per capita at $15,000 per person. Its world ranking is 18th, behind Saudi Arabia and ahead of Iran. Here are the top 5 African nations by GDP, starting with Egypt at $1.81 trillion in 2022. Second is Nigeria with $1.37 trillion. Third is South Africa with $997 billion. Fourth is Algeria with $629 billion. And fifth is Ethiopia with $393 billion. As you can see from this chart, there is a big difference between GDP PPP and GDP nominal. This implies a relatively low cost of living in Egypt, as opposed to, say, the USA, for example. Egypt's economic future is expected to be driven by a number of factors, including the government's continued economic reform program, which aims to reduce the budget deficit, improve the business environment, and attract investment. Second, by increasing investment in infrastructure, such as roads, railways, and airports, which will boost productivity and create jobs. And third, a recovery in tourism, which is a major source of foreign exchange earnings. And finally, let's turn our attention to the military. How does Egypt compare to the world and other African countries? Egypt is ranked 10th in the world in military personnel and 25th in terms of military expenditure at a little over $11 billion in 2022. Egypt has the largest military in both Africa and the Middle East. Both Egypt and Turkey are similar in yearly expenditure and military hardware numbers. The Army is the largest service branch of the Egyptian Armed Forces, with 310,000 active personnel. Egypt's most significant engagements in the 20th century were in its 5 wars with the State of Israel: the 1948-49 Arab-Israeli War, the 1956 Suez Crisis, the 1967 Six-Day War, when Egypt lost the Sinai, the 1967-70 War of Attrition, and the 1973 Yom Kippur War, when Egypt regained the Sinai. The last major engagement was Operation Desert Storm, the liberation of Kuwait from Iraqi occupation in 1991, in which Egypt constituted the 3rd largest contingent behind the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. The Army has 1,300 M1 Abrams tanks, which is an American design but made in Egypt under license. It also has 2,700 of the older M60 Patton tanks from the U.S. and modernized for modern warfare. It has 500 T-62s purchased from the Soviet Union, 200 of which are active, while 300 are in storage. And finally, 840 of the older T-55s, all in storage. The Egyptian Air Force operates all military aircraft, including those in support of the Army and Navy. It has 30,000 active personnel. The bulk of the fighter force is made up of 240 F-16 Fighting Falcons from the U.S., with 46 MiG-29s from Russia and 24 Rafales from France, with 30 more on order. The U.S. has agreed to sell Egypt F-15E Strike Eagles to replace the aging MiGs. Most of the cargo duties are handled by 21 C-130 Hercules transports from the U.S. and 22 C-295s purchased from Spain. Helicopter attack duties are primarily achieved by the 46 AH-64 Apaches from the U.S. and 39 Ka-50s from Russia, the 19 CH-47 Chinooks and the 62 Mi-17s handle helicopter-borne transport. The Egyptian Navy is the largest in Africa and the Middle East. It is the 12th largest in the world by number of ships. There are 18,000 active personnel. Most of Egypt's modern warships are sourced from France. Egypt purchased 2 Mistral-class amphibious assault ships from France when a deal to sell them to Russia fell through because of the war in Ukraine. The Frem frigate also was purchased from France. Egypt has many more ships, but these are the most modern in the fleet. In recent years, the Egyptian military has been modernized and upgraded. It is now one of the most powerful militaries in the Middle East. However, Egypt faces a number of security challenges, including terrorism, instability in Libya, and a rivalry with Israel. The military will need to continue to adapt and modernize in order to meet these challenges. In conclusion, Egypt is poised for a promising future with strong prospects for economic growth, infrastructure development, and technological advancement. The country's strategic location, rich cultural heritage, and abundant natural resources provide a solid foundation for success. Thanks for watching.